As you know, this is an hour-long documentary produced and directed and researched and everything by George Sibley with Gale Productions out of Gale Force Productions out of Florida. He's been a filmmaker for over 40 years, mostly making educational films and documentaries. Based in Florida, he's fond of telling lesser-known stories of American history to wider audiences. In 2007, a film he made about the British colonial period in Florida, yes, Florida was once British as well as Spanish, was selected Outstanding Achievement in Educational Media by the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. Last year, in 2009, his film Shadows of David Thompson was widely shown in cities across Canada and the United States as part of the 200th anniversary of Thompson's most important explorations. Since Thompson established the first European posts in what is now Idaho and western Montana, several historical societies and museums in the Idaho Panhandle participated in the bicentennial and also showed the film. Montana Public Television also broadcast the program, as it did Sibley's earlier film, Lewis and Clark and the U.S. Dale Bosworth is here tonight with us as well, standing back by the front desk. He was so gracious to accept the invitation to be a part of this evening and to answer any questions and any discussion we may have after the film. So if you would like to stay for that, we will hopefully have that going on until about 8:30. Dale Bosworth was raised in Northern California, the son of a Forest Service employee. He graduated from the University of Idaho in 1966 with a degree in forestry and immediately joined the U.S. Forest Service. He served in a variety of positions in Idaho, Montana, and eastern Washington, including District Ranger of the Powell Ranger District near Lolo Pass. In 1986, he became Forest Supervisor of the Wasatch Cache National Forest in Utah. He later served in Washington, D.C. and California, and in 1994 became Regional Forester of the Intermountain Region of the Forest Service, headquartered in Ogden, Utah. In 1997, Bosworth became Regional Forester for the Northern Region in Missoula. He was named Chief of the Forest Service in 2001, where he served until he retired in 2007 after 41 years with the agency. Since retirement, he does volunteer work for the Forest Service's international programs, and he resides in Missoula, Montana with his wife, Karma. Quite a busy person you've been for 41 years. I'll pass it over to you. Obviously, you're very interested in getting started, and I'll hand it over to George, and I've gotten buttons to start it when you're ready for me.
Oh, okay. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry you're kind of sardined in here a little bit, but it is really neat to be here in such a historic spot to show a historic film. And I'm especially happy to be here in Missoula, not only because it's any excuse to be in Missoula is always a good one. It's just a great place to be, and I envy all of you folks who live in and around the city, but also because Missoula was a very important staging area for the crews that went out to the fires, and of course Region 1 of the Forest Service is headquartered here, another major component in putting together the teams and in organizing not only the firefight in 1910, but a disproportionate number of chiefs of the Forest Service, one of whom is here with us tonight. I'm really glad that Dale was able to come because for a couple of reasons. He's a man I admire very much and was just delighted when he appeared in the film, in one of the interviews in the film. And I know you want to get to the film, but just let me alert you, I guess, to an interesting component of my technique of telling stories on film. Unlike most documentarians, I hate the whole idea of the sound bite, where you hear a sentence or two of someone, and if you're lucky, they come into the movie later on, and maybe you recognize him or her, or maybe you don't, and maybe they identify them well, and maybe they don't. And to me, this just fragments what the contribution or contributions that these various interviews can add to the movie. So my technique is to try to figure out a way to include a meatier portion of what these experts and eyewitnesses and other folks have to offer to the story, and sort of to hand off the narration of the movie between my own narrative voice, sort of structurally organizing the movie, and all of these other people who have, in many cases, fascinating things to say. And you couldn't have a better example of that than Dale's contribution to the film. It's always nice to get a non-active chief to say something, because you don't have to put them at the mercy of the organization. But Dale, it was a very well-spoken chief, one of my favorites of recent years, and all the things that he was so eloquent about when he was active chief, he hasn't lost his touch. He did a great job in the movie as well. So I'm just glad. And so one of the things that you might be interested in is thinking about how the movie is progressing from my narration through what these other people have to offer. And since we're fortunate enough to have one of those people with us today, you might be interested on his perspectives on how well or badly the film deals with the way he added his remarks as well. Okay, all of that is just preparatory, and I do much better on film than I do off, so without further ado, let's take a look at the movie.
This film was made possible in part by the Idaho Humanities Council.
In 1910, industrial America had finally discovered the Northern Rockies. Loggers and miners and railroad men poured into this rugged and once remote region. Towns like Wallace, Idaho, were putting down roots. The Forest Service, just 5 years old, was trying to impose some order on it all by managing the forest reserves on which the local economy depended. The federal government was now in the conservation business, which mainly meant putting out fires before they could damage the public's forests. With primitive equipment and few trails in the region, this was a tall order. And Eastern industries worried about how this policy might affect their raw materials. Then came a disaster which shaped both Western landscapes and attitudes toward land management that are with us to this day. Fire has always been a part of the woods. In fact, forests and fire grew up together. Although lightning is as old as the earth, it took marine plants to produce the oxygen that made sustained fire possible. and terrestrial plants to colonize enough of the land to provide fuel. And the planet was never the same. Fires create and arrange forests, and forests create and arrange fires, in a dance that has been going on for over 400 million years. The earliest humans learned to live with the fires that lightning and forests had evolved. Then they captured fire and figured out how to modify and reshape the natural fire patterns for their own uses. Native firemakers opened up the landscape. They changed the timing, the size, and the frequency of fires, so that animals might graze closer to camp and hunters see them better. They got rid of underbrush and hazardous fuels, so that tribes could move more easily in their seasonal travels. They encouraged the early return of grasses and the growth of berry patches. As soon as the land dried enough to burn, people burned it, creating a patchwork of burned and unburned vegetation that, among its other virtues, limited the spread of wildfires. When nature's fire season arrived, lightning had less fuel to work with. Native people shaped their environment on a vast scale. America's Great Plains and much of the landscape around them were maintained almost entirely by native burning. Europeans barely noticed. They shrugged off Indian burning as they had shrugged off the Indians themselves. Europeans also used fire to help them clear and fertilize the land, but by the end of the 19th century, most Europeans regarded the use of open fire as a primitive technology, wasteful and unreliable, fit only on a small scale for getting rid of unwanted trash. They wanted their fires restrained and controlled, boxed up inside a locomotive or a fireplace, doing productive work. Productivity, or at least making money, was on everybody's mind during the 19th century. Half the country's public land, over 1 billion acres, was transferred to private ownership during those years. The railroads got a big chunk of it, but the number of farms in America increased 400%. Under the original Homestead Act, farming was the only legal way private citizens could get land from the public domain. To get public land for timber, you had to say it was for farming, which was to commit fraud. The great forests of the West inspired a lot of fraud, which, in turn, inspired the country's earliest timber laws in the 1870s. The new laws, though, still talked only about land for individual private use. There was still no real plan for dealing with commercial logging, and the new America was being powered and built using wood. Congress finally reacted to what was increasingly being seen as the destruction of a valuable public resource by creating forest reserves in 1891 and laws to administer them under the General Land Office in 1897. That responsibility was transferred to the Department of Agriculture in 1905, when the U.S. Forest Service was created. Responsibility mostly meant protection, and protection from fire most of all. The lumber industry, and the West in general, was always skeptical about any federal bureaucracy which might interfere with what they saw as their own local resources. But these new national forests would still be open for commercial use. And so the stage was set for the first real test of the federal government as manager and protector of America's natural wealth.
The so-called Great Fires of 1910 are one of the defining moments in the history of fire in the United States. Prior to that, there had been plenty of large fires, most of them associated with colonization. So we have dark days in New England. We have 3 million acre fires in Maine, New Brunswick, 1825. And this pattern of settlement fires moves west with land clearing and generally land use and burning. In 1910, however, something had changed. A system of state-sponsored conservation had come into place. When 1910 hit, the outbreak of fires marks really the first time we had tried on a national scale to fight fires. Not just settlement fires, but fires that were in areas that would not be converted to farms and towns. An entire apparatus for firefighting came into place during that summer, and it is still with us. Almost all of the manifestations of what we might call the American style of firefighting came together. Bringing people from the outside, mobilizing the army, heavy government investment, off-budget spending justified by emergency conditions, post-fire emergency responses. Almost the whole system comes into place and gets embedded. It gets written into the heritage of particularly the Forest Service, and then through the U.S. Forest Service, the other federal agencies, and through the federal agencies into a national program.
It began with an unusually dry spring. The snows melted by the end of April in 1910, but the rains never came. And that month, the first fires broke out.
The winter of 1909-1910 was a relatively near normal winter as far as precipitation and snow. But according to the statistics that we have, the months of March, April, May was the warmest 3-month period on record in the springtime. That allows the fuels to dry out a little bit quicker than normal. During the course of the year, May and June are typically the wettest months in central Idaho and western Montana. June is the most critical month for potential for fire season, whether or not we might have a big one or not. June of 1910 was remarkably drier than normal, approximately 25% of precipitation than what we normally get. Precipitation in Orofino, Idaho was only about 9% of normal for the months of June and July. If we've had a dry spring and June is dry, by the time July and August hits, we don't have a chance to catch up with precipitation. The other two key ingredients for a big fire season are the source of ignition, which is lightning, and wind. Climatologically, we get most of our lightning in late June through July. Every local area has their own term for a strong wind. You have the zephyr winds on the east side of the Sierra, Chinook winds on the east side of the mountains in Washington, and you have the Palouse winds. It's local to that area, so they just call it Palouse winds. Looking at old Weather Bureau maps from 1910, it was a strong cold front that pushed through the area with very strong pressure gradients, which is very conducive to strong winds. Typically by mid-August to late August, about 70% of the time after August 16th through the end of the month, we see a cold front that moves through the Pacific Northwest and western Montana. The Palouse wind is associated with a cold front. When I work on forest fires, the most concern from fire behavior analysts is what are the winds going to do? If you get a strong wind that lines up with a west to east oriented canyon, that's going to do nothing but help enhance the speed of the wind. Sometimes we can get gusts to near 45 to 50 miles per hour in Kalispell just from a push of air channeling through those canyons. The timing of such things are pretty critical. In order to get such an extreme fire year like we had in 1910, all the pieces of the puzzle have to really fit.
June was a quiet month. Halley's Comet had returned after one more trip around the sun, but it was too low in the sky to be seen from the northern Rockies. In July came lightning, right on schedule, and fire season began in earnest. Most of the fires, though, over 75% of them, were caused by people. Out of 128 Class A fires on the Coeur d'Alene National Forest that summer, at least 102 were started along the Milwaukee Railroad. fires died and fires rekindled. Each new flare-up stretching firefighting resources a bit thinner.
The 1910 fires happened a very long time ago, and it's difficult to dig up all of the information that we would normally have accessible to us if we were looking at a fire that was more recent. They may have been a little larger, there may have been more of them, but they follow a very similar pattern, where lightning fires and human-caused fires, burning in very dry years, eventually are fanned by high winds associated with cold fronts. And that's a pattern that's been in the Northern Rockies for many years and probably will be for a long time. People who were eyewitnesses to these fires and in towns around the area of the Northern Rockies in 1910 report very high winds on August 20th and 21st. Yet most of the weather stations at the time do not record very strong winds. Lewiston, Idaho did record gusts up to 40 miles an hour on the 21st, but most of the stations recorded winds that were averaging in the mid-teens, 10, 15 miles an hour. There are many reasons perhaps for why we don't have records of higher wind speeds, but remember that these weather stations are located in cities outside the mountains. They were manual observations, and so there may have been different winds in the mountains where the fires were. Fires will create something called pyrocumulus clouds, and these are very, very similar to cumulus clouds associated with thunderstorms. And high winds are very common with cumulus buildup and thunderstorms, and some of the winds likely experienced by people near these fires were associated with downdrafts from the cumulus buildup from the fires themselves. Also, the fires are a tremendous heat source, and there are strong indrafts associated with these fires. Another reason for high winds has to do with fire whirls or vorticity, very similar to tornadoes. If you get a swirling of the indraft winds, you can have winds reaching 100 miles an hour in the vicinity of the fire front. And those kinds of things may be responsible for the wind-thrown trees and the other kinds of wind damage that was observed on these fires. All of the indices of fire danger, which we can reconstruct, suggest that the fuels became unusually dry. The pattern contributed to having fuels very, very flammable throughout a very large area.
By the middle of July, there were fires burning all over the Northern Rockies, as well as in Glacier Park, the Cascades of Oregon, and in northern Washington. British Columbia was especially hard hit, as were the national forests on the border between Idaho and Montana. Men were recruited from all over the West to fight fires. Trains brought them to staging areas like Missoula, Montana, where they were issued equipment and assigned to crews. On August 7th, President Taft called out the Army. It still wasn't enough. As soon as one fire was controlled, another would break out. Among the soldiers joining the fight were elements of the all-black 25th Infantry Regiment out of Spokane. On August 17th, Companies G and I of the 25th began cutting trail along Placer Creek toward a big fire threatening Wallace, Idaho.
The United States had never marshaled so many people to try to fight a fire before. So it was a literal army of 10,000 people trying to fight this thing. They grabbed hobos off the train and they summoned immigrants and African American soldiers, people in the hiring halls everywhere in the western United States under the leadership of, a handful of young 20-something forest rangers. Basically, they were just men in canvas pants and floppy hats and shovels and axes, and they went up to try to dig a line. You had this almost perfect snapshot of the hodgepodge that was the United States at the turn of the century. In my book, I traced two young men from the north of Italy who grew up in this tiny little village, and I went back to the village and there was actually these plaques in honor of these men who died in service to the great conservation dream and the big wildfire of the American West. Now this was the peak of Italian immigration in the United States. We were getting something like 200,000 Italians a year. 2 million of them came in less than a generation's time, and they'd heard about these copper mines out in Arizona, so they went from their little town in Italy called Rovara Canavesi, went across the Atlantic, landed in the East Coast, then took a train out to the Arizona Territory, worked in these terrible copper mines with crappy pay. And when they heard about this fire up in Idaho and Montana, it was a wonderful opportunity. So they took the trains up north and signed up. They were going to make 25 cents an hour, and they worked 16-hour days. And both of these two men ended up being among the people who fell during the 1910 fire. The Irish, of course, who had come a generation earlier, they were called the Famine Irish because they had fled the famine. Their parents had fled the famine, which killed 1 million people. And there certainly were a lot of Irish immigrants from Butte, Montana, which at the time was the most Irish town in the United States. There was more Gaelic spoken in Butte, Montana than anywhere outside of Ireland. Many of the Irish left Butte, which was only several hundred miles to the east of where the fire was breaking out, and took the trains to Missoula and unloaded them. And one of the fellows I followed, fascinating guy, was named Patrick Grogan. Pat Grogan shows up in Missoula, Montana, a little bit overweight, a little bit slow in the step, with his dog. And he gets off the train, and the young Forest Service guys, they're literally plucking men off the train. They described just grabbing anyone who was upright, who could walk, because they so desperately needed bodies to fight this fire. But he convinced them, that he could do the job. He'd done 1 million odd jobs in Butte, and so they hired him as a cook. And so off he went to cook in one of these massive fire camps. The blow-up has happened. The Forest Service sends a kid up there, a messenger, saying, "You must get out now. You must flee. The fire's approaching. It's blown up. You're all going to die." And Grogan makes a stand. And he says, "Lads, I think we can make it if we just stay here." And Grogan convinces about half of the crew to stay put with them. And it's a disaster. Some of them run for the flank, some of them run for the valley, and they die within about 10 minutes of each other. And they die just horrible deaths. Flame catches them, their lungs are filled up with smoke, their bodies are charred. When they find some of these bodies, they don't even recognize them as human forms. But what they know is roughly the time of death, because they find their watches. They have these watches which are in their vests. And that's what happened to Patrick Grogan and his dog.
Most of the men injured or killed by the blow-up, 101 of 116 claims for financial compensation, were working in the Coeur d'Alene National Forest. The Italians and 5 other men died in a root cellar where they had taken shelter at the homestead of Joe Beauchamp. Joe himself was among them, crammed elbow to elbow in a tiny pit. A falling tree killed 2 other men outside and trapped a 3rd man, who burned to death in front of the rest of the crew lying helplessly nearby. A mile away, 18 men died in a burning cabin. Grogan and his people were killed outside Avery on Setzer Creek. 8 others suffocated at the Bullion Mine. It was a night of confusion and terror. On the morning of August 20th, Ranger Ed Pulaski headed back to the mountains with supplies for his crew. His wife Emma and 10-year-old daughter Elsie rode with him to the edge of town, which Ed was convinced would burn. On the way back, Emma and Elsie saw a bear. Emma told her daughter it was a dog, so as not to frighten her. "I may never see you again," Ed had said, but he and his packers continued on toward the lake he had named for his daughter. Ed's men were scattered along the ridge, fighting a losing battle with a fire front 30 miles long. Hundreds of separate fires had turned into one enormous fire, and it was bearing down on men and towns as well as trees. The packers turned back, but Pulaski found as many men as he could and headed them down the trail toward Wallace. Much of Wallace was evacuating by then, taking special trains to Missoula or Spokane. The dire predictions of the town's imminent demise seemed to be coming true. In the St. Regis Valley to the east, Taft, Hagen, and DeBorgia, Montana, were already burning. At 8:30, Emma put her daughter to bed. She had vetoed Ed's suggestion that she and Elsie take one of the trains to a safer place. Meanwhile, Pulaski and his men were surrounded by flames, including a backfire that had been lit to protect the town. Their only hope, Ed thought, was an abandoned mine shaft on the west fork of Placer Creek. So the men piled in, 45 of them, plus a couple of horses. into a shaft maybe 80 feet deep. A few began to panic and wanted to take their chances outside. But Big Ed drew his pistol and threatened to shoot anyone who tried. A neighbor came to tell Mrs. Pulaski that the fire was close to town. Emma wanted to wait a while longer, until she could see the flames from her window. She later wrote that she knew her husband would either save his men or die trying. Around 9 o'clock, she saw the fire. She and Elsie spent the night on a pile of mine tailings and watched the beautiful, cruel flames. A third of Wallace burned. Many buildings survived because the town had also burned 20 years before and had been rebuilt mostly with bricks. When morning came, a man stumbled into town and reported Pulaski's crew had all been killed up on Placer Creek. Inside the smoky tunnel, men were stirring, and someone said, "Look, the boss is dead." "Like hell he is," Ed answered from where he had just come awake. All but 5 of the men survived. They made their way down to Wallace, where people were beginning to take stock of what had happened. Men were burned and men were missing. Some of them surely were dead, but nobody knew how many. Phone and telegraph lines were gone, railroad bridges destroyed, and all around them the forest was a charred ruin.
I've seen the morning with gold hills adorning, the dread tempest roaring before parting day. I've seen shining silver streams glittering in the sunny beams grow troubled and dark as they rolled on their way. I have seen the forest adorn the foremost with flowers all the fairest, both pleasant and gay. So bonny was their blooming, their scent the air perfuming, but now they are all withered and gone away.
It was the biggest wildfire in American history. When the estimates were all in, it added up to over 3 million acres burned, an area almost as big as the state of Connecticut. But it wasn't a classic frontier fire, such as the fires that burned around the Great Lakes in 1871. Nearly all the people caught by the flames here were firemen, not farmers. The area was mostly public land. Except for a few settlers, there were just loggers or miners or railroad men, until the fire crews arrived. In the days following the blow-up, the number of dead was revised downward. In terms of human losses, it wasn't as bad as people thought at first, but it was still bad enough. We take for granted a high level of training and professional ability in the people who fight fires for us now. But there are still some folks around who remember what it was like to recruit fire crews off the street.
In 1949, the assignment that the Forest Service had was to put out all the fires, and we did that really well. In those days, the Forest Service didn't have their hotshot crews and that sort of thing. Whenever they had a fire, they'd go to the logging camps and go to the taverns, and they'd go find people wherever they could. Foremen and squad leaders had a lot of experience in recognizing whether or not the fires would be dangerous. And usually, almost always, they were correct. On rare occasions, they missed them, but until Man Gulch, they never did lose people from misjudging a fire. When we got to Man Gulch, I always said there was about 20 acres burning. And in 10 or 15 minutes, we'd gone from a very benign little 20-acre fire on top of the ridge to something really bad in the draw below us. And it was coming up fast. We were angling up the gulch. The fire was coming up the gulch behind us and gaining on us rapidly. Sounded like a freight train. Within a few minutes, I looked back and I could see the people in the back of the line were really outlined against the fire. And it was pretty obvious that we were really in trouble. That's the time that our foreman, Wag Dodge, decided to light a escape fire. And he said, "Up this way." And Rumsey and I misunderstood what he meant by "up this way." What he meant was, "Come up here and we'll get inside this thing and lay down and we'll be protected by the fuel that we've burned away." And when he said "up this way," we looked up the ridge and there was the top. And so we went for it. And we were very fortunate that the two of us did make it over the top, and we were the only two that did. The estimates that people have made are that it was probably burning 35 or 40 miles an hour. Once it got going, it's kind of like a chimney effect. It really started coming up the gulch. They say that the winds were blowing 60 or 70 miles an hour in 1910. And based on our experience with a 30 or 40 mile an hour wind in Man Gulch, it's obvious that those people couldn't do anything with that fire. It was not controllable. The only thing they could do is try to get out of the way. I'm just amazed that they did as well as they did.
With few roads in the region, the railroads played a vital role in getting crews to the fires and civilians out of harm's way.
There were lots of people living along the railroad tracks, and there were also several towns and work camps there. One of the more infamous was Taft. Taft was a real hellhole. When the fires of August 20th approached the town, the Forest Service went through the town knocking on doors and asked them to give a hand with the firefighting, and nobody responded. They were determined to drink every last drop of booze in the town, and they did. A fire crew suggested, why don't we backfire and just let the town go? Hundreds of people lived along this 15-mile segment. There were laborers, there were miners, there were homesteaders, there were Forest Service personnel. When the fires came, people fled up to the railroad tracks to see if they could get out of there. The railroad was built in a hurry, so they built wooden trestles, obviously fire hazards, and the trains that were running up and down the tracks had to go over burning trestles. It must have been just absolutely horrifying. Grand Forks was another infamous place. Prior to the big fire, there was a whore that murdered a customer and burned down the building, and consequently it burned down the town. But the fire of August 20th did consume the town of Grand Forks also. The people fled up the slope to Falcon, hopped on a train, and over the burning trestles they went into a tunnel. Probably a couple hundred people evacuated to that tunnel from down the tracks. The Taft tunnel saved a bunch of people too. They had to stay in one tunnel 8 days. It took that long to rebuild some trestles so they could get the folks out of there. From the adding up that I've done, I think the total of people saved by the railroad in that 15-mile segment was probably close to 1,000.
Nobody who lived through the big blow-up ever forgot the experience. Their families still talk about it today.
I grew up here along Little Beaver Creek in the shadow of the legend of the 1910 fire. My mother used to tell us the story about it, and it was totally fascinating.
For several days it had been real smoky, but it wasn't until about 6 o'clock that we saw the flames at the top of the mountain. I was 5 years old. My dad had gone to Thompson Falls between trains. He had ridden a horse to Belknap. The train was late, and so he didn't return home at the regular time. So my mother decided she'd have to milk the cow, and as she went out and picked up the bucket, she looked up at the mountain and saw these flames shooting up to the tops of the trees. We had just gotten through haying, and so she told Hazel they'd better start getting some things wet because the fire was already starting to throw cinders and things ahead of it. The reason that my dad didn't get back was on account of the train being late, of course, and he had tried to get home, but when he got to the top of the hill, he met the fire, and so he just figured we were burned up, and he turned the horse, and they raced back to Belknap as fast as they could go.
The houses and buildings around this country had roofs made out of either cedar shakes or out of sawn larch shingles. And this was part of the problems that they encountered, because when the embers flew through the air, they'd land on top of these structures and immediately start them on fire.
At 10 o'clock, two men just walked in, and they started putting fires out that started on the barn. Then at midnight, two more men came. Mother and Hazel had just about decided to wet some blankets and go out and cover up in the field when these men came. And that's the reason that the buildings were saved.
One of the interesting comments my grandfather said when he came back the next day was it was more like going to a funeral than going home. But then when he saw the buildings here that gave him assurance that they were still alive, he said he bawled like a child. Bell outran the fire, and he kept that horse till the day it died.
My mother always told us the story about her uncle, Pete Peterson. He was down in the Wallace area during the 1910 fire, and things were getting pretty intense, and so they asked him if he would move these boxcars along this siding. And so all night long, he was moving the cars from one area to another to keep them away from the flame. And it was a tedious job, but he kept doing it because this is what he had been told to do. And when the fire was all over, then they told him that the boxcars were full of dynamite.
My aunt, her name was June Gray, and she lived in Moscow, Idaho. But when she was a girl, she and her mother lived in Wallace, and the mother owned and ran what my aunt called the hotel. When the fire was about ready to overtake the town, everyone was ordered out on the train. I think they went to Spokane. And when they came back, they viewed the remains of the town. They stood looking over the hotel, what was left of it, and my aunt describes looking down at the ashes, and there was the corpse of a man lying on a metal bed, which had previously been on the second floor.
The smoke was so bad that it was just black like night, and they couldn't see. They had some chickens, and they went to roost. They went down to the mouth of Swamp Creek. And then my dad decided he'd take the team and go back and see what he could save. And he got the homestead. And while he was gone, the smoke got so bad that they thought he was gone. And when he came back, he had the big piano on the wagon. And how he got it on, no one knows how. They had nothing. Everything had burned. But he saved the piano. And that piano is still in the family.
In the summer of 1910, the Kent family, along with several other families from Bonners Ferry, decided to make a longer journey than they usually do up to the Yak country for camping purposes. When they arrived at their favorite camping spot, they set up, but were not there too long before a ranger arrived and informed them that a fire was out of control to the east and that it was necessary for them to pack up and get out of there. By nightfall, they had arrived halfway back to Bonners Ferry, and they decided for safety purposes to take the women and children down to the ferry landing on the Kootenai River, have them taken across to the railroad town of Leona, and from there they would be taken by train back to Bonners Ferry. The men would then take the buckboards back to town.
My family lived at a little town in Montana called Tusker, which is between Trout Creek, Montana, and Thompson Falls. The family was concerned about the smoke that was coming into the area, and then when the flames started coming over the top of the mountains to the west of them, the little train that come through to pick up the mail and the cream cans, the women all got on that train and went to Thompson Falls. But the men decided that they would stay there and try to protect the buildings as best they could. And when the fire did get close, why, they all hid in the root cellar. And of course they were one of the fortunate ones that survived. My family were all Christian people, so there was probably a lot of praying went on during this time.
I am the granddaughter of the people that lived up on our old ranch when the fire went through. About the middle of August or somewhere thereabouts, the sky got kind of dark, and the next thing you know, the wind was blowing pretty hard, and ashes was flying through the air, and the smoke was real bad. And my grandfather, Joseph Bowes, went up to the South Mountains, which was about 3 miles from our place, the foot of the mountains, set a big backfire. And then he hurried back home because he didn't know what was going to happen. When that fire came over the mountains, it was really going fast. And when it hit the backfire that my grandfather built, it sounded like a bomb going off. They said it was a terrible boom and caused the fire to split and go on each side of our place. Never burnt our house, but it burned all the trees real bad. There wasn't a limb or anything, just the big black stubs sticking way up.
Noxon was saved. They'd got a line around Noxon, backfired and whatnot. And my grandmother had been 11 years old then. We think they went down to what was called Marion's Island and stayed at the neighbors until the fire passed over Noxon and Heron country. And she could remember with her mother the troubles they had trying to pack these half-wild animals to get to the fire camps. There was groceries and a lot of stuff was strewn up and down the streets. A lot of the men were in fire camps. One fellow that worked for my great-grandfather, Shelton Smith Brown, his name was John Erickson, a Swedish immigrant, a bachelor type, and quite a strong drinker. And they were in Copper Gulch, and the fire came up Bull River, and they basically ran for their lives. John ran out of Bull River, carried a can of snus in his right hand. That's the only thing he came out with. And his partner had turned around and went back for his suitcase and perished in the fire. You know, a lot of these guys that worked, a suitcase was only possessions, that's all they had. And Henry Laurie went back for his suitcase and perished in the fire. Most of the people went for the river and stayed in the river along with deer, bear, and anything else that came their way to escape the flames.
Well, I was remembering about my aunt and my mother, Helen, telling me about them standing on the hill called the Baby Hill. It was called the Baby Hill because Grandma had lost 2 babies and they'd buried both of them there because Grandma could look out and see them there. And they could see the fire coming over the mountain, and my Aunt Lily was holding on to Grandma's dress, and she said she thought it was exciting.
2 days later, rain and snow, part of the same cold front that had fanned the flames, put most of the fires out. The dead were buried where they fell, and something like 90 people in all were lost. The disaster deeply affected the Forest Service.
Even as the big blow-up was underway in August of 1910, articles were appearing in newspapers and even in Sunset Magazine, for heaven's sakes, arguing that the whole policy, the whole strategy of firefighting was wrong. They said it would lead to ever larger fires because fuels would build up, it would lead to forest health problems, you'll be overrun with insects and diseases. This kind of debate that we've gone through in the last couple of decades very publicly is actually a very old one. It goes right back to the foundations. Partly, I think, because of the trauma of 1910 on the Forest Service itself, the sense that it was such a public defeat. The agency was determined that it would continue the fight. Many of those in positions of authority. I think of Gus Silcox, who had been the number 2 man in Missoula during the firefight, later wrote that the lessons of the great fires were that they were wholly preventable. An incredible statement to make. And in 1935, Gus Silcox is now chief of the Forest Service, and he's got all the men and political will anyone could ask for, and there is going to be a universal policy to suppress all fires. So in many ways, half of the history of American firefighting is the consequence of 1910 putting into place this really sort of hardcore policy to abolish fire. And the other half of the history has been the attempt to overcome that policy and find some way to reestablish fire in the landscape. Because the pattern of fire that had existed for hundreds, probably thousands of years, had been severely disrupted.
The Forest Service had been established to a large extent because it promised to rid the woods of fire. After 1910, the agency ratcheted up its commitment to that primary mission. Chief Silcox spelled it out in April of 1935. The goal was to have every fire in every forest out by 10 a.m. the next day, or at 10 a.m. the following day. No quarter given until every fire was out.
Fire has probably been the number 1 priority, or at least one of the highest priorities for the Forest Service throughout the whole history of the agency, and starting, when you go back to 1910. When I became a professional forester, my first job was in a place called Avery, Idaho, on the St. Joe National Forest. And the little house that I rented when I moved to Avery, the landlord was there in Avery in 1910. He and his mother went out in one of the last trains, the Milwaukee Railroad train, to get out of Avery, and the trestles that they crossed were on fire. And he used to tell me basically how terrified he was of what was going on. I used to have discussions with other young foresters about, could we ever have another 1910? And at the time, I'd argue that we really couldn't because of the technology that we had available even in the 1960s. Because of the air tankers, because of the engines, because of the training, because we had more roads and better access, we had smoke jumpers. And so my belief was that we would not ever have that kind of a situation. And of course the technology today is even better. But over the years I've changed my opinion. Even with all the technology, we can have another situation like 1910. In the year 2000 we had a record year for fires here in the northern region of the Forest Service. We had a number of dry lightning storms. Almost every lightning strike started a fire. We had gone for weeks, months without any rain. And so we had fires everywhere on almost every national forest of western Montana and northern Idaho. If we'd have ended up with the winds that we had in 1910, I believe we would have ended up with a situation like we had in 1910. We don't put firefighters into situations today like we did maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But even at that, we still lose firefighters. And that's generally because we ended up in a situation where we just weren't paying enough attention to what was happening.
America's firefighting efforts have reached epic proportions. We're approaching the practical limits of mechanical fire suppression. But fire is a biological as well as a mechanical process. And as we look for a more balanced way of living with nature, it's worth remembering that the nature Europeans found here was profoundly shaped by human-controlled fires.
In order to solve the fire problem in terms of the public, we have to learn to live with fire, but we also have to come to some consensus on how we want to manage those forests. The public in general, I think, believes that the way to solve the fire problem is to get a bigger fire department. And politicians buy into that view as well. So the expectations are that we should get bigger aircraft that can drop bigger loads of retardant, have more firefighters, get bigger engines, and that way we can put the fires out. And that just simply is not correct. And the fact that we've been putting fires out for the last 100 years has created some conditions in the forest that make them highly flammable. So the policies have changed. A major policy change that occurred in the 70s was to allow certain fires to burn under certain conditions. It really depends upon the conditions that that particular forest evolved with. Trying to reintroduce fire into areas that had frequent fires earlier throughout their evolution, it's very, very difficult.
Big forests and big forest fires have long been associated with the West. Learning to live with fire, though, is a national concern.
Fire is part of Florida, and it's something that we need to have back, especially on our conservation, our protected conservation lands. As we got farther into the century, our cities began to swell, and we began to run into a dilemma. These natural areas that we had begun to protect were being squeezed, and the natural processes that actually formed and painted the picture that is natural Florida couldn't work anymore. All the fuels that those natural fires and those Indian set fires and those old cracker set fires used to burn away were coming back to haunt us. The fuels began to build up, and we began to have catastrophic wildfires in Florida. So on conservation lands especially, we need to somehow try to mimic or replace those natural processes that can no longer work as they did. But we have become in Florida very intolerant of smoke, for instance. You can't put smoke on highways. We can't put smoke in cities, near schools, near hospitals. On the Nature Coast in Hernando and Citrus County, during the growing season, which is the most important time to burn in Florida, generally the prevailing wind is a sea breeze. That's a west wind. Any burning done to the west is going to blow smoke across a major toll road, limited access. What land managers are forced to do then is to limit the number of days per year that they do burning, limit the size of their burns. The ultimate result of that is going to be more pressure on the species that are adapted to fire and fire-adapted habitats, and ultimately just a diminishment of the quality and the function of our conservation lands.
The big blow-up of 1910 did more than inspire a debate about fire policy. It also helped bring into focus, for a lot of Americans, the values of publicly owned land.
The reason this fire was so consequential was not just that it was a big fire. We have a lot of big fires and they come and go, but the Forest Service was just 5 years old. It had just been created by Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt leaves office in 1909. In 1910, the year of the fire, a hostile Congress is trying to defund the Forest Service. They don't like them. They don't think there's any reason to have them. They're being harassed in the woods. In Montana, a forest ranger is shot and killed, and the person who killed him is not prosecuted. He claims he mistook him for a deer. And when this fire happens, even though they lose the battle, the press makes it out as this mythic, heroic event. And Teddy Roosevelt himself is touring the western United States, and he's giving these thunderous speeches that these young men, their deaths must not be in vain. And the heroics of these forest rangers saved the Forest Service by rallying public opinion. A month after the fire, Congress doubles its funding and passes a bill that creates national forests in the East. You would not have national forests in so much of the eastern United States without this fire. We now have in excess of 220 million acres run by the Forest Service. We own that public land. And I argue that maybe you probably wouldn't have that big patch of ground if it hadn't been this fire.
Ed Pulaski recovered from his burns and went back to work. He insisted he was no hero, but to everyone who heard his story, he became a living legend. He and his fellow rangers helped pay the medical expenses of other firefighters. And after years of complicated paperwork, the federal government also came up with some money. The men who died at the Bullion Mine were reburied in Wallace a week after the fire. Pulaski tended the graves himself and argued for a suitable monument. In 1912, the rest of the fallen men were brought down from the mountains to a cemetery in St. Mary's, Idaho. And in 1924, Congress appropriated $500 for headstones.
It's a great story, an extraordinary story, a Western story, a firefighting story, but what further embeds that story into the lore of American firefighting is that in the years afterwards, Pulaski devised a tool in his backyard forge, combining a sort of a hoe and an axe, and eventually in a primitive form gave us what became known as the Pulaski tool. Shovel, rake, and Pulaski tool are the fundamental hand tools of firefighting. And the Pulaski tool is the one that is both unique and universal to wildland firefighting. It is the symbol, really, of wildland firefighting. And every time somebody picks up that tool, in a way they are retelling the story of Ed Pulaski, which in many ways is part of the founding story of American firefighting.
That story long deserved a more permanent monument, and now it has one.
The recreation you see behind me is the culmination of 8 years of work of the Pulaski Project. The Pulaski Project started in 2002 as an attempt with a group of interested citizens in Wallace to try to save this trail. I had been hiking the trail since the mid-'80s, and it had generally been abandoned by the Forest Service, mostly because a lot of the trail was on private property. So we wanted to save the trail. It was close to Wallace. It had a great story behind it, and the trail itself is very beautiful. It follows the West Fork of Placer Creek the entire way. It's 2 miles long. There's waterfalls and cascades along the way. There's the War Eagle mine about halfway through that has remnants of mining activities. The hardest thing to save the trail and to save the tunnel was getting easements for the trail itself and to convince the Forest Service that they needed to spend some time and energy in redoing the trail. There's actually 5 bridges on the trail. We had to helicopter the logs in. We had to helicopter in rocks for a rock wall that overlooks the site. So we had to get out the story to the public, and I've given different speeches to chambers of commerce and Elks clubs and things like that. And I actually get emotionally involved when I start talking about the people that lost their lives and the people that actually were saved by the fire. I think it's very important to Idaho history, to regional history, and actually the history of the United States.
Forest fires are more about rebirth than about destruction, and this fire was no exception. The big blow-up of 1910 has generated books and family stories as well as trees. But sparks still flicker in the woods, and the wind blows over the mountains. And one day, they will join their forces again. Well, thanks everybody, and thank goodness we didn't have a fire here, because this would have been a heck of a... And I have to say one thing before we have any questions or anything. Terry Howe's aunt's name is June Gray. He was the guy right after the lady who told the story about moving the dynamite cars. And every time we get more than 10 people in a room that sees that story, that gets the biggest laugh of the, or comment at least in the movie, you know. So I feel a little bad for Terry because nobody ever gets to hear who his relative was there, and he tells his story and stuff. So I know I'm going to have to do a big explanation job up in Bonners Ferry when we show that, because that's where all those folks are from and stuff. But, did anybody have any questions or comments on the movie? Yes.
Was all of the footage historical, or was there a lot of recreation scenes?
The only recreation scenes were, in terms, I guess you call them recreations, the trestle scenes that had fires on them, those were just historic shots of trestles, because I wanted to give you a little bit more of the excitement. You know, I did a limited amount of that with some of the other historic scenes too, and part of that reason for that was that there are only so many pictures of the 1910 fires. And I knew, especially this year, they're going to be all over the place. So I tried to come up with something that didn't do any violation, I hope, to the historicness of those pictures, but that made it my own version of what those pictures were like. But more specifically, the kind of reenaction I think you're talking about is people with actors and stuff, and that those scenes were to tell the Pulaski story. The scenes of the horsemen leading the pack train up there, those were historic shots. And then I merged over into my own recreation, which was done up in Sanders County. The Sanders County Historical Society, who's one of my partners in producing the movie, they helped me track down family stories and stuff like that. They put the word out. And we got almost as many reenactors as Pulaski actually had. And so we filmed it. But of course, you can't go into the tunnel anymore. And even if you could, it'd be impossible to film there. So the scenes of the guys going, fleeing the fires were done. And I used a trick sort of like what you see on your local weather show, where the weather lady or the weather person is standing in front of a green wall. And we take that green out, and you can put other things in the background. So, and also, to keep with my theme of combining black and white and color, I think it was pretty clear. I was way in the back, and my eyes are bad today anyway, but I think you might have noticed that the guys were in black and white, and the fire was in color. So they were put together in that same kind. But it's a lot harder to do that trick outside on the side of somebody's barn or something than it is in the comfort of a weather studio in your TV station. So it was, it was pretty hard. And I had to pray, just as they did in 1910, and unfortunately their prayers weren't answered, but I was also praying for no wind that day, because my green screen is made out of cloth. So if you get the wind up, you have a very hard time having this background and stuff. So it was basically that, and then I felt that the women in the Pulaski story, that's another thing that makes that story so wonderfully symbolic. Ed and his crew represent not only his very well documented experiences, but a lot of other fire crews whose experiences weren't so well documented, including the so-called lost crew that Timothy Egan has in his book and was featured in the film as well. It's not exactly clear what happened to the so-called lost crew, which included Pat Grogan. And one version of the story is the one that Tim tells in the movie, but that's not the only version of the story. There are other ones that said the messenger never got to the lost crew. It was just a message that was nailed to a tree and never got to them, and they're called the lost crew because nobody really knows what happened to them. But oral history, as you saw, is an important part of the way I chose to tell the story, because I tried to bring back a little bit of that immediacy and take my chances on potential factual errors and stuff. And all of these people are telling family stories maybe 2 or 3 generations away from their family members' experiences. And darn it, you have to lose a little bit of material. And I just missed an opportunity to meet who I believe was the last survivor witness of the fire, a lady named Lillian Obdi, and you hear her story told briefly in the film at the end. That was the gal telling the story about the baby hill, which I found quite moving. They called it the baby hill because of the babies there, and her aunt who clung to her grandmother's skirt and thought it was exciting. That was Lily Obdi, and she almost made it to 103 years old. She passed away I think at the end of last year or early this year. career. And so I was actually working on the movie, and I heard of her, and she was quite spirited right up near the last, but she became, you know, a little bit failing. She still had her mind and everything, but she was just, I didn't want to intrude on her world. Sorry for the long-winded explanation there. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I didn't quite follow the story about the woman and her daughter, the woman who was putting her daughter to bed and then didn't want to move until the very last minute?
Yeah, that was Ed Pulaski's wife.
Okay, so he survived and they survived.
They all survived. Ed was the ranger who took his crew into the tunnel. And then at the end of the movie, you saw the so-called Pulaski Project has now recreated the outermost posts of that tunnel. It was real hard to find for a long time because the vegetation has overgrown it so much. And the day I was going to film, the day before I was going to film Jim C. of the Pulaski Project at that tunnel, I hiked up there the day before, just partially because I wanted to see it, but I also wanted to see it by myself in the quiet and before I had to make decisions about how to film it and stuff, you know, because this is an emotional story, you know, and a story that, you know, I tried to get a handle on first in my own head before I decide how I'm going to do the filming of it. So I walked up there, and they hadn't yet finished. They had completed the reconstruction, but there's now a stone wall in front of it that sort of parks you right in front of it, and there are little placards there and stuff that indicate where the tunnel is. Because when I came up there, all of a sudden I realized I was at the end of the trail, and I said, did I miss something? You know, I had to back up a little bit and peer around, and all of a sudden there it was. Because it wasn't, even with the post on it and stuff, it takes a little looking to see it. So I imagine how difficult it was to find it in the old days. Steve Pine said it took him 3 tries to get up there and find it. But he was writing his book about 10 years or so ago, and there wasn't much attention. And the present trail, which has been somewhat streamlined from a trail that went up and over the ridges quite a lot, it makes it much easier to get out there. It's a beautiful trail.
Where does it start, if you wanted to do it?
It's a mile south of Wallace on the Moon Pass Road. That's where the trailhead is, and where the West Fork of Placer Creek comes in and joins Placer Creek there. Yes, sir.
The part where you talk about recruiting the firefighters themselves, they were obviously not dressed in yellow suits and
no.
In fact, you were kind about them. Many were hobos that were kind of hijacked.
They were.
Hijacked is a better term?
Yeah, they were, yep.
The Rangers often behaved, if not given the authority of actually recruiting forcibly to get the crews.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Kirkwood, the first professor of botany, was surveying northern Idaho in the summer of 1910. In a 30 or 40 page report, he talked about the wobbleys. Does that mean anything to you?
Yes.
They were on the fire lines, and in fact, they were so socially against what the government was doing that they were lighting fires and doing anything they could to actually disrupt the fires getting controlled. Now, that's an element of our sociology of our country that you probably would have been inappropriate to put in here. But the mines in Butte were experiencing the same thing with the same type of people. Mm-hmm. Disruptive.
And the same crew, the 25th Infantry of Buffalo soldiers, who were often given the dirtiest jobs to do, they, in the 1890s, when those IWW riots were happening, they were sent into Wallace to suppress what was feared to be a revolution there between the mine administration guys and the people who wanted to form unions. And it was the same regiment, not the same people, obviously, and they camped on the ball field in Wallace, just as they ended up doing it during the 1910 fire. It's kind of an interesting bit of trivia. But that's an important component of the story, but it's a good example of the things that you have to make a call on in an hour. You know, what can you and should you include? And I wouldn't not include something for politically correct reasons. It's just simply that I have to make a call on what's important, and I try to do justice to the overall balance of the story. But an hour, after all, is not not a whole heck of a lot of time. You know, the people who write books, how long does it take us to read a book? 8, 10 hours, something like that. And so you get a much greater level of detail, and I envy writers for that. We in the movie business are much more severely limited, and it's hard to even make simple factual points. It wasn't that you know, you didn't do anything wrong not to miss certain points of the movie, but you only have one shot at it, you know, and unlike a book, you can't flip back a few pages and figure, was that Emma, and where's Elsie, and what's that? You know, there's you don't have that cost. So that's something that we're dealing with all the time in film, is that in documentary film, I suppose even in dramatic film too, because there might be an important plot point that you really want people to pay attention to.
How long did it take you to make it from start to finish?
About 10 months, which is a crazy, that sounds like a lot of time, but that is really short for an hour. And you need to do almost as much work, you know, man or woman hours in a given length movie to your standard of, you know, graphics and all that kind of stuff. So somehow you have to cram all those hours into a shorter deadline. And it was really, we came literally right down to the wire, because the only way I really make any income on the movie is to sell DVDs at these events, and that means I had to get the movie done even earlier than the first showing of the movie, because I had to ship it back to New Jersey and have them actually make up the DVD versions of it and stuff. So it was real dramatic. Years ago, I used to work for a public television station, and I said, I'm getting out of this because I can't take these deadlines. This was crazy.
Little did you know.
They say the worst boss is yourself, you know, so I backed myself into that corner. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for coming. If you think of any other questions, I'll be over there. Yes, one more, yeah.
Talk about it that's downtown at the farmer's market. I think part of its lore is that it may have been used early in its career to pull some of the trains from Wallace to Missoula.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's something you're...
Good story. Yeah, I've not heard that. But.
It was in the Missoulian in an article about that locomotive a number of years back.
Well, my mother was born in Wallace in July 1910, and in August the fire came, and she and my grandmother were brought to Missoula. And it was a legend story.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was. That's a great. I mean, a lot of scary stories of that. And it was one of the interesting things about Dale's interview was that I had no idea that I tried to do some prep work on his background before I met him, but I didn't know that he was stationed in Avery. So that I was as delighted as everybody else when he told that story. So we had to give it as you know. He told one of the difficult stories to illustrate in the movie with the burning trestles and stuff. So we had to rise to the challenge now, because I had another important character in the movie telling a good story that we had to support.
And are there any questions or comments addressed to Dale back at the front desk about fire management policy, etc.? Would you like to go?
See here, you're just trying to mind your own business, and they want to put you on the spot again.
Yeah, I have a question. I appreciated George's comment in the film about firefighting is like now today of astronomical proportions and so on, and there are like millions and millions and millions of dollars being spent on fighting fires. What would you say would be a reasonable solution to that? Because obviously having bigger planes, bigger machines and so on is not a solution. I mean, how can we continue or start managing fire again in such a way so that we're not spending billions of dollars?
My belief is that the fire problem is really a land use problem, not a fire problem. And I think we as a society haven't come to agreement on how we want to manage our wildlands or the lands around communities in the wildland-urban interface. And so we fight. And while we fight, forests burn, and we spend money trying to put them out. And my belief is that we have to try to come to some consensus, which might be things like thinning and reintroducing fire in a controlled way, being more tolerant of smoke during that's created by prescribed burning, as we seem to be okay with our laws when it's a wildfire as far as smoke, but we're not okay if we set a fire to try to prevent a large wildfire later. And I just think that some of these policies and the land management issue are the things that have to be dealt with if we want to get on top of it. I also believe that it's going to be costly for a while, but in the long run, I think it would be cheaper. I mean, it seems to me like it makes sense to pay people to remove material from the woods and then use that material for things like biofuel, for lots of things. But even pay people to take it out of the woods so that we can get fire reintroduced in a controlled way. And in the long haul, I think that we would all be better off. But we don't have any consensus for that.
Does your successor believe
Well, there are efforts. There's different legislation that's been considered and to try to promote some of those kinds of things. But there's still not any kind of public consensus around that. I mean, there's still a lot of findings on what the right solutions are. But what bothers me is the notion that if we get a DC-10 or a 747 and load up with retardants, maybe now we can put these fires out. And because we now have DC-10s and 747s, $50,000 a crack to drop retardant in one of those. And while those may be helpful in certain places at certain times, that's not going to be a solution for the long run. That's sort of the point I want.
Does your successor feel the same way?
I think so. I've had a lot of, I know my successor is no longer my successor's successor. But both the people that have followed me in that job, I know very well, and I believe that they feel the same way. That's really how we got to deal with it.
I think one of the strengths too is that we're treating wildfires as a land use issue, land management issue at least, unlike some other parts of the world who are consolidating wildland firefighting with structural firefighting and just making one kind of all around 911 call type of deal. And you make other decisions. I think you'd agree, Dale, if you lump them together in that way, there are wonderful possibilities that Dale has just been talking about that we have by treating wildland fire as a land use issue, that if you start boxing it into every fire must be put out, we're taking giant steps backward. Europe is going in that way, unfortunately. Russia privatized their forest firefighting efforts.
It's a huge deal in this country when we, in the 70s, finally started allowing some fires in wilderness areas to burn under certain conditions. That was a huge thing. And for folks who were around, I'm sure a lot of you folks were around, it was debated in the newspapers, people were fighting about it, they disagreed, some thought we should do it, other people thought it shouldn't happen. But it was a huge step. Yeah. But we've still got, that was sort of a baby step. And now it's in the 70s, and here we are, 40 years later, and we've expanded a fair amount since then, but not anywhere near where we need to be, in my opinion.
I have a really dumb question. It's probably a dumb question, but wait, you set a backfire? How do you know which direction it's going to go? I mean, how could they do that?
You mean when during in
yeah, like in the Wallace case, they set a fire.
I think that's why they set it and ran. I'm not too sure that. But people have been around, our firefighters today that do a backfire or a burnout, they'll look at, they know fire behavior very well. They know where the prevailing winds are. They know the kind of suction that's taking place from the main fire that's going to be drawing that fire in, and so they're pretty good at it today. But in 1910, it was more of a Hail Mary kind of a thing, because that was sort of for a lot of people, it was a last hope. I mean, this is the only possible way that we might be able to save our farms or our towns. So that's amazing they did that.
I'd like to ask the filmmaker why you interjected the 1947 Man Gulch fire in a film entitled 1910.
Well, most of the firefighters were not from the areas where the fires were. So it's very hard. In fact, in my case, it was impossible to find any family stories or any stories that directly went back to firefighters. So I can't see making a movie about a fire without doing justice to the experience of the firefighters. So I went to a man who is one of the few people that was recruited off the street. He wasn't recruited as a smoke jumper, but the year before, he was on a pine beetle crew, and he was recruited from the pine beetle crew to be a firefighter. So he knows what it's like to be an untrained person off the street and to be a fireman. So, and he also went through one of the most terrifying fires ever. Certainly in some ways on a small scale equal to what the fire crews went through in 1910. So to try and bring, and it's a first-hand experience, which is something that I couldn't find in any of the other fires. So
it was pivotal in the history of the Forest Service, I think, as you will attest, by itself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
It had its own spin-off in changing the way fires were fought.
it's in a place called the Gates of the Rockies up near Helena. Yeah.
I have a question. What is your feeling about the pine beetle? If you go to Georgetown Lake, just brown trees everywhere. What's that going to do for fire danger?
Well, it's huge. I mean, you know, you get all that fuel out there, and if you have the right conditions, you get fires going. I mean, there's really no way to control it until you get some rain. And, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem all through the West right now.
That'll be the next big burn.
Well, it sure could be. I mean, the time that's the worst is when they turn red and you still got all the needles and the small twigs. You know, after about 5 years, then some of the small twigs fall, and the larger when the branches start falling, then you start losing some of the real fire threat. But during that 3 or 4 or 5 years that these trees are first dead, it's terrible.
We haven't had that so far.
No. Well, we lucked out this year with a lot of rain.
Now, has there been a consensus about logging those trees?
No. I'm not working now, so I haven't. But I can tell you from my observations is there's not been a consensus ever about logging anything. Maybe
the dead ones out of the woods.
And there's reasons for that. I mean, there was a lot of heavy logging that took place for a number of years. There's a lot of strong feelings about that. But what folks are looking at today more is removing some of the dead materials, and trying to make use of that and do some thinning so they can get fire back into these fire-dependent ecosystems. It's an entirely different kind of an approach than the logging that was going on in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So, you know, I think there's more to consensus, but we're still a long ways from having complete.
Probably the biggest change between 1910 and now is the number of homes that are constructed in that desert zone and the amount of potential future developable land that's also in that zone. But with private property rights being such a sensitive issue, how do you ever legislate or regulate or fix things before more homes are plunked into the desert zone?
You know, I'm a believer myself that through county planning and maybe with help from insurance companies and how they apply insurance rates, some of those kind of things that make incentives for people to, if they're going to build in those places, you know, that's okay, but build in a way that you can protect your own home. And but right now, when there's a big fire, if there's any kind of a community near it, all the firefighting resources go to protect the community, and there's very little left over to try to suppress the fires.
What's going to happen if the retardant is found to be as dangerous as they're now saying it is?
Well, you know, I mean, fire retardant has been a pretty important aspect in firefighting. Although, you know, I mean, there's probably not a bad thing to be looking to make sure that there aren't some side effects that people didn't realize, and maybe that'll also, maybe out of that we might end up finding some other kinds of formulas for fire retardant that might be a little safer. So it's not all bad. And we've also had pretty good luck with using big helicopters equipped with buckets and water in certain kinds of conditions too. And so sometimes we don't have the aircraft where there's also other ways. The only way you put a fire out is people on the ground. I mean, the planes help in slowing it down and stuff, but you got to have people on the ground to put a fire out.
It is 8:30, so we would save the program for those of you that need to move on. I think both Dale and George are available to answer any other questions of individuals. So thank you very much.